Welcome to the Entrepreneurial CEO podcast, where we dive into the real stories behind building and scaling a business. Each episode, we sit down with CEOs, founders, and leaders to uncover hard-won lessons in leadership, systems, and team building. Listen in each week to learn directly from real business leaders who have been in your shoes, had success, made the mistakes, and all of the messiness that comes with building a business. If you're ready to learn from real-world leaders and gain insights you can apply today, you're in the right place. So let's get started. Hey, Darius, how are you, man?
Hey, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. Thanks for being on the show today. Well, folks, today's guest is Darius Mirshahzadeh, serial entrepreneur, business expert, and author of a great book called The Core Value Equation. Darius is the former CEO of The Money Source, which he scaled into a massive business, the largest non-bank mortgage lender in the US. Darius is passionate about helping leaders, like all of you, to build core value-driven organizations, helping people thrive through accountability, growth, and really strong cultures, which I think is fascinating. I'd love to learn more about. Darius also hosts the Greatness Machine podcast, where he talks to an amazing list of high achievers, people like Seth Godin, Moby, Chris Pronger. As a hockey fan, love Chris Pronger. So I'm sure you have a lot of insights there from all the amazing people you've spoken to. And so today he's joining the show. He's going to talk to us about lessons learned through the amazing success he's had. And I'm sure everything he continues to learn with the incredible people he talks to all the time. So Darius, thank you so much for joining. I have a lot of questions to ask, and I'm sure we have a lot to learn.
Yeah, let's do it, man.
Cool. So let's start at the beginning. Like, how did you, I always think it's interesting to hear how people make the jump from into becoming an entrepreneur, to starting their own business, not being in the comfortable trap of just getting that paycheck. So how did that come to be for you?
Yeah, it came to be by me never actually getting the paycheck to begin with. So I grew up, my father's an entrepreneur, my father's father was an entrepreneur, and I'm 46. I grew up in an era where being an entrepreneur was not being a rock star. It was very different than it is now. But I grew up watching someone be an entrepreneur. So I grew up, I remember my dad said to me once, he said, I'd rather make $25,000 a year than $250,000 a year and have to get a paycheck. So that's when you hear someone say that when you're 15 years old, you watch someone for the first 18 years of life just show up every day and kill what they eat. It normalizes it, So and I had a pretty big interest in making a lot of money, and so those two go hand in hand. If there's no cap, there's no limit on how much money you can make as an entrepreneur. The cap is what's the richest person on earth? That's your cap, and maybe that's not your cap. It's if you beat them, right? So for me that was just kind of that's an avenue, and a lot of that comes, I think some of that's nature and some of that's nurture. So when I went to college, I was kind of 2 years in, I'm like, why am I even doing this? I can just I'm never going to have a job. But I was always pretty good at school. So my folks were kind of pushed me to stay in school, but I literally almost dropped out after my second year. And then, but I have a twin brother who's been my business partner for a long time, and he was not a very good student, but he's very good at sales. And so he got into the mortgage business. And when I got out of school, I had a degree in bachelor's in accounting. Business economics and accounting, and I have a twin brother making $10,000 a month selling loans, and I was like, okay, I can go get a job at Arthur Andersen making $50,000 a year as an auditor. Actually, I couldn't because they wouldn't hire me, but I tried. I didn't make it very far. I did actually try to get a job at PricewaterhouseCoopers and Arthur Andersen, but they quickly dismissed me. I was not. When you make a joke about a partner piercing your ear at the associate lunch, it doesn't go over very well. So I was like, I'm not cut out for that. And I already started businesses when I was in college. My brother and I started our first business, real company, where we lost a lot of money by the time we were 21. And it was just always never really an option. So I was always like, man, I'll just go do what my brother's doing. And so that's what got me into the mortgage industry. Through a lot of ups and downs, ended up doing that. And then that ended up becoming my first business. And then did that for a long time and ended up building a very large non-bank lender. We were a 1,000-person organization, top 20 FHA, VA, and USDA lender and servicer in the United States. One number 9 highest rated CEO in Glassdoor for the country in the entire United States. But really built an awesome company and obsessed over a long period of time on how do you build a world-class company, how do you build a world-class culture, and now I'm in private equity. I'm trying to invest in companies. I'm in a different space, so I'm in wealth management. But just always I always tell people I've never gotten a paycheck that I didn't create the revenue to pay the paycheck. So any salary I've ever gotten, it's because I created the revenue from zero that ended up paying me that salary. So
it's incredible. You just said that you obsessed over how to build a great culture or the culture. Like why did you choose that to obsess over?
I don't know. So I wrote a book, as you mentioned, called The Core Value Equation. And 2 doors down from me, I live here in Austin, Texas, is a guy whose name is Aaron Franklin. And he's the #1 pitmaster in the United States. So this guy, he's like, if you go to masterclass.com and want to learn how to make barbecue, it's him. Right. Mm-hmm. So this guy's kind of famous. And Austin's a famous town for barbecue. And so I got to have lunch with him one day. And we're talking. And I said, "Oh, how'd you get into barbecue?" And he said, "Well, I didn't find barbecue. Barbecue found me." And I remember I was kind of annoyed because we were there for 2 hours. I ended up going home after lunch and Googled him and found this Vanity Fair article because he's like a famous chef about his story. And I ended up reading this amazing story. And basically the gist of it was he didn't find barbecue. Barbecue found him. And I was like, well, I guess he's tired of telling the whole story. The story was awesome. It was like a 20-page Vanity Fair article.
The TLDR.
It was total TLDR, but it was a very interesting story. And so anyway, I remember I left that lunch and I was at this point where I had exited my company. I had stepped down as CEO of my company at TMS. I ended up exiting in 2020. And I remember this was actually before that. So this is before COVID. And I remember thinking, but I was at this point in my life where I was like, man, I'm really trying to figure out what's next for me. And I remember I was jealous. I was like, oh man, I wish I had a barbecue like that. And then I had this realization because I had written the book at that point where I was like, well, I do like core values. I didn't find core values. Core values found me. And so for me, it just resonated. I've always been someone pretty obsessed with leadership. I was a student leader, athletic leader growing up. I was always in sports and always on my podcast, The Greatness Machine, I interviewed Gabby Reese, the famous volleyball player. Yeah. And she said something that resonated with me. She said, "I'm a hand raiser. I always raise my hand." And I said, "Oh, I'm a hand raiser too. I always raise my hand." And I've always been that way since I was literally, I can remember being that way when I was in first grade, kindergarten, stuff like that. I remember I'm always someone that will volunteer to do stuff. Like if someone needs a volunteer in the class, I would be the kid that would raise my hand. If there was a volunteer for a sport, I would volunteer. So I've always been a hand raiser. And I think some of that's just nature and nurture, a lot of that's nature for me. It's just how it's my essence. I'm naturally a leader. So for me, there's just an interest in how do you get people to coalesce to build cool stuff together? How do you get a group of people I always got really energized by teams. I always got energized by people doing great work together. I always loved sports for that reason. And I loved student government for that reason when I was growing up. And then I ended up loving I've always loved people too. So if you love people and you like to get people together to do stuff, and that's really what we're describing as a culture, right? So for me, I just didn't know that's what it was called when I was a kid. And then I got to see in business, oh no, I get to actually curate this. I get to build this myself.
I'm very curious. Okay, so I think, such a big piece of, you built 1,000-person organization, super successful. With a lot of the successful businesses, it's because they have amazing teams, right? Maybe you have a great culture. Maybe you just have super talented people that are all bought into a vision and working hard together. But building that team is oftentimes hard. When you talk about, finding a hand raiser, I think that's really interesting, right? That's a certain characteristic or trait that somebody has that maybe gives you a signal they're going to be an amazing team member. Did you have a way to find those people through an interview process that was maybe non-traditional? How did you find those people, or how did you identify what those attributes were to build that amazing team that allowed you to be so successful?
Well, for the hand raiser, it was really more about myself, right? But I think what's a steel sharpens steel, or like attracts like. And so for me, what I realized, taking a bigger step back, was that how do you do that at scale? How do you build an organization where that kind of happens organically? And what I figured out was a lot of it just comes by being like kind of saying who you are to the world and making sure that it gets out there and then it gets promoted and leveraged in the right way, so that when other people use that as a kind of a vetting mechanism, or the organization uses that as a vetting mechanism, you can weed out the people that aren't what you're talking about. So, so what we're talking about is how do I build a world-class team? It's going to be different for every single organization. In some organizations that maybe have a more of a strategic or like meritocracy, or maybe a little more old school, might be around like best idea wins and it's cutthroat, and that's what they consider to be a world-class team. Whereas I would walk into those environments and it would turn me off because I'm more of a collaborative leader. And so I think that this comes back to your values. And what I learned was, the core values are these like words that kind of say what you are. And if you say what you are, then you can A, hold yourself accountable to that, and B, you can hold the team accountable to that. And it becomes this like kind of soft test against what you're trying to build. And then you can weave those things into your organization through a hiring process, through performance management systems, through these more traditional mechanisms. But it starts with values. I always say everything starts with core values. You want to look at your results, look at your core values. And if the core values are misaligned, it creates a lot of friction. And that'll show up in a lot of different ways. And a lot of times it's just that people just see the world in different ways within an organization or outside of an organization. But what I would, when I started like kind of getting into that, and I did it a number of different ways, but the big way was through Entrepreneurial Organization and through their MIT program. I got introduced to this concept through Vern Harnish, through Scaling Up. And then I went on a journey because I did it the wrong, every good piece of advice I give, you can always be very confident that there's nine acts of sin that created that one piece of good advice. Like I fucked it up 9 ways from Sunday before I got it right the 10th time. So for me, that held true with core values for sure. But I got really curious. Like I am a learner, so I get really curious when things aren't going my way, and try to figure out, hey, how can I turn that around? How can I change that? And so that said, I realized that, core values don't need to be nice. And we get told that core values, like if you look at most company core values, like you line 10 companies up, 9 people will say that they have core values or 10 people will say they have core values. And 9 of them, if I ask their employees what the core values are, they won't know them. And so I'm like, well, do you really have them if people don't know what they are? Right. If a tree falls in the woods and no one sees it fall, did it really fall? Right. So, the reality is that I think that most companies do a pretty bad job at this. And what I found was that's a really great tool to use to start to attract what I want, because I say what I am. But they have to be, and my book goes into it, talks about they have to be designed, they have to be authentic to the organization. There's no that's a well-worn path, but they have to be designed for scale in the organization, and then they have to be used appropriately. And what I would say, if you want people to use stuff, make it easy. And so my book kind of walks through, it's really a good companion for maybe a scale, like a scale program like MAP or EOS or Scaling Up with Vern. It's a very good companion for those systems, because what it does is it really defines the behavior of the organization in a way that's true and authentic and in the tone of the organization. When that happens, it has the opportunity to become the language of accountability in the organization. So for me, that was always my tool of choice. So going back to your question, which is how do I attract the hand raisers? What I say is, I'll use my last company as an example. Number 1 core value was people matter. Number 2 core value was inspiring leadership. Strength of character was number 3. And the 4th one was rock solid service. So that second one, inspiring leadership, is like, that's a hand raiser. And we weren't perfect at it, by the way, but the goal was to find inspiring leaders, because, you show me the leadership, I'll show you the outcomes of the organization. So
that's right. Yep. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think you have to be able to go back to my point. You have to be able to build that world-class team and have great leadership if you want to be a successful company. It's so funny, with the more people I talk to, the more people say that with everything, it's just stepping on landmines over and over and over again until you finally find something that works. It's just so many mistakes. That's just the path. So you built the money source into a super successful, scaled organization. I mean, I think, I think building from zero, from nothing into something is very challenging, right? Just getting the
Sure.
ball moving, but also that scale. So like, were there any unique challenges that you encountered that you can share that as you were starting to really get into some scale in the business?
Oh, I mean, tons. I will say this, that we went from essentially startup to 300 employees in 18 months, which sounds
Wow.
sounds very daunting, but you know, what we did a really good job with is we rolled the core values out and leveraged them really aggressively to just give people a language to kind of hold themselves and the team accountable. Because when you're growing that fast, you don't have time to build what I call scaffolding. You don't have time to kind of build the connective tissue between departments or systems. It's just not possible, right? Because if you're growing that fast, it's because you have more business than you can handle, which is a good problem to have. But that really opened my eyes up to the fact that you can do what I call in my book invisible scale. I can build invisible scale because if you and I both share the same values around working hard and being overly communicative and not taking, not blaming each other and taking accountability for the outcomes and like being a servant leader to our team, right? Like kind of eliminates a lot of the bullshit, right? Things will break and we just kind of work through it, right? As opposed
That's
to
right.
if I don't have that connective tissue, what ends up happening is things will break and then we fight about it. And then that creates more friction, right? And
Yep.
so what I found was we did a really good job of building a team that supported each other through shared values. And that got us to that 300 person mark with fairly unscathed. It was actually pretty easy. What I learned after that was when we went from 300 to 1,000, which we did that in about 18 months, was that love would only get you so far. So we had to build the systems, and we didn't. And when you grow from 300, 0 to 300, it's a lot. 300 to 1,000 was really hardcore, a lot of growing pains.
Yeah.
And we ended up, this was in 2016 when Brexit happened, and then when Trump won his first term, the rates. I was in a mortgage interest rate environment or a business that was defined by mortgage interest rates. When the rates collapsed, rates went vertical when Trump won his first term, and that automatically we shrunk down to 500 people in about 6 months. So
Wow.
yeah, I had a lot of whiplash in that business, and learned a lot. And then we ended up scaling back up to 1,000 again over the next couple of years. But that time we had time on our side. I mean, in 2016, my biggest month, we added 140 people in 1 month. It's hard to imagine if you're growing from
Yeah.
550 to 700 people. Like that's insane. You're adding like 44 people a day, 5 people a day. It's not in a massive company. That's like 10. It's 1% of your workforce you're adding per day.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And that's assuming you work 30 days in a month, which you don't. So you're really adding seven people a day, right? And then when you're growing like that, you probably are working 7 days a week. But yeah, I realized that you need to build the scaffolding to support the groups. And I knew it. I was like, when you're growing like crazy like that, you're like, screw it, I'll just pay the price, right? Which is what we did. And I always tell my team, I said, sometimes you're throwing touchdowns, and sometimes you're cleaning up the stadium. So when we were throwing touchdowns, I was like, fuck it, we'll deal with it later. And then once the market turned, then we were cleaning up the stadium, and that was most of 2017. When we did that, we got to take a breath and build the infrastructure that wasn't there, upgrade our systems, upgrade some of our talent that maybe wasn't able to keep up with the growth, and in doing all that, we really got ready so when I grew the second time from 500 to 1,000, it was pretty easy. It was nothing really.
What changed? You mentioned systems. Like, what were some of the systems that you put in, or was it process? Was it tooling? Like,
Yeah,
maybe just high level.
all the above. So it was
Yeah.
bringing in managers in some departments, it was replacing the leaders because the departments had outgrown the leadership. It was having, salary laddering and, building out roles and responsibilities and, streamlining the HR side of the business. It was upgrading our payroll system, HRIS system. It was launching a learning and development management system. It was building a learning and development and management department. It was building a change management department. It was all these things that we just didn't have the time to do. By the way, ironically, we tore half that stuff down because we're like, because we had so much complaints for not having it the first time that we ended up building it all, and then it ended up being a bunch of bureaucracy. And we said, oh, well, this is like not great either. So we ended up getting rid of most of it, and really just kind of realizing that there's complexity and simplicity. So what I always tell people is, if you want to scale, and you and I talked about this, off air, that I really look at an organization as pods of 10 people. How many pods of 10 people do you have? And the more number of pods of 10 people you have will require different systems at different levels, right? So if I have 10 groups of 10, that's 100 people. That's way different than if I have one group of 10, right? I don't have to, because it's not just linear. It's not just 10 times. It's actually 10 by 10. It's 100 different groups can interact. Those 10 groups can interact with 10 different groups, 10 different ways, right? So I need more complex systems to manage 100 versus 10. The same is true if I go to 1,000, right? 1,000 people is really just, 100 groups of 10, right? And so the system that worked for the 10 groups of 10 may not work for the 100 groups of 10. What I figured out, more or less, and at least my belief, and I never got above 1,000, was probably what works at 1,000 would probably work close to 2,000 or 3,000 too, because the systems are complex enough to manage at scale. Now, and my sense is probably what works at 2,000 or 3,000 doesn't work at 10,000. But very few companies get to 10,000 people. So I wasn't worried about that. For me, it was like, hey, I'm trying to grow a couple $100 million company, and got there, and maybe I'll grow more than that. But it was, it's just really around building the systems to support those pods of 10, and whether and the thing I got really geeky about was, it comes down to having less moving parts in the business. So having the same types of meetings, having the same cadence of meetings, having the same performance management, making sure people do one-on-ones the same way, making sure that the cultural assets of the company are clear and that we're repetitive about it, and people know the core purpose of the business and the mission, and they know why we're doing what we're doing. They know what our BHAG is, and they know our values, and they're able to talk to each other and leverage the language of values to hold each other accountable. And then we have a great, system of record. We use a system called Sensei Labs. You might use Asana to manage our tasks and projects. And there's accountability and systems around following up on what goes in there. And there's systems on how that stuff goes in there, right? And then it came down to one really key thing that I learned, Andrew, was people tend to take on too much. And so mine was, hey, how do you keep people focused on what they need to be focused on, and creating dashboards around that? And it was just kind of like layering these things on top of each other and making sure there wasn't too many to manage. But really having that like complexity around simplicity. How can I make this as lightweight as possible and as replicable as possible, so that what works at 10 will work at 100, and there's some best practices around that. There's a lot of books out there that teach this stuff, and it's not rocket science, but you got to be disciplined, and you got to pick what works. And look, a lot of it's trial and error. You can kind of mitigate that by bringing in a coach or advisors. That'll help. But at the end of the day, you kind of have to do it too.
Yep. I think the point you make about capacity of the team is really interesting to me, because I totally agree. I think especially with high performers, they want to take on more. They're ambitious. They want to take on more and more and more, and eventually they're just going to drown. And so as a manager or leader, helping them to understand their limits and plan it out, I think, is a really important point that sometimes gets missed.
Yeah, I think one-on-ones and performance management is a good way to do that. Having KPIs that people are clear on what they own in the business and what success looks like, So those are the things I look at, and I go, hey, if that's what it is, then if you're doing it, but you got to keep it simple. Like what I find is a lot of consultants, like, they get paid to make it complex, and so I got pretty disciplined about, like, hey, my wife has a letterpress. She used to do letterpress, which has a thing hanging on her wall that says, "Stop, listen, there must be a tougher way," or "Stop, listen, there must be a harder way." And I think most people live by that mantra. They make it complex. And mine's like, "Stop, listen, how do we make this easier? How do we make less moving parts? How do we make it where people just look at it and they get what it is?" Like an iPhone, the reason why it's so damn successful is because it's easy to use. Same with an iPad.
100%.
Same with a Tesla. Is it any wonder that those are two of the most valuable companies on earth? No, it's because they're easy. People don't have to think very hard about it. Freaking Tesla will drive you without you driving. That's why people like it. They don't break down. You don't have to change the freaking brakes, So Elon's got that right. Regardless of what you think about him personally, he built a great company based on simplicity, right? And it's a very complex product, but the way it operates is simple, and people pay for that. People pay for simplicity.
I couldn't agree more. Especially the iPhone is a perfect example. The watch, the phone, you have many other examples of products that were on the market before them, and they just beat them due to their simplicity and the way that it works.
Yeah. So what I would challenge you and listeners on is, how is your organization making things simple, right? Mm-hmm. There's simplicity and complexity. And what are you doing to make the internal way you run your business simplistic and easy. And if you're not making it easy for you and your team, then you're probably moving in the wrong direction. Because I will tell you what, and people probably see this, and you may see this all the time at MAP. If I make it hard, what does the team do, Andrew, when it's hard?
What does the team do at MAP when it's hard?
No, yeah, at any company, if it's complex and hard and confusing, what does the team do with that project or thing?
Good question. I mean, at MAP, we've got a pretty cool product called team consulting where we all get together collaboratively to try to solve the problem. But I don't know if that's where you were leading.
No. The answer is simple. If it's hard, people generally just don't do it. Like, oh, it's hard. Oh, those are like, if I get a complex set of directions on assembling something, I look at it and I go, that's hard. I'll go get to it later, and later never comes.
Procrastinate.
Yeah. So things that are hard, people tend to not do. I'm not saying not everybody, but most people. Most people are like, that's hard. I'll just go do the thing I know how to do. Right. So when we start rolling out new initiatives in our business, or we do things that are complex, and you're trying to get multiple people aligned around the project in hand, and if it's too complex, they tend to kind of like just not do it. I call it voting with your feet. They'll just vote with their feet. They'll be like, yeah, I'll walk away from it. Right. And so for me, I got really clear on, if you want to build a world-class team, you got to make it easy on them. You want people to do stuff, make it easy. You want to make them remember stuff, make it easy. You know, it's really simple. If I want anything to happen in my business, or if I want my clients to buy from me, guess what? Make it easy on them. If I make it hard,
it's the same thing as sales, right? It's the same thing when you're trying to sell. You have to make it easy to get the conversion.
Make it easy. Like, people don't buy complexity. People walk away from complexity, you know? And so if I want to scale my company, real simple, make it easy. And you know, the best way to make it easy, make it where there's not a lot of stuff to remember, and that it's easy for them to get their stuff done. And the more you do that, the more people will lean into it. The more they lean into it, the more output you'll get. And I just found, like, the way I do that's with less moving parts in the company. And I let the cultural assets do the work. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? What needs to happen right now for that to happen? And then I leverage systems like weekly meetings and quarterly meetings and one-on-ones and stuff like that. These best practices to do that.
Okay. On your podcast, The Greatness Machine, you've talked to some pretty incredible people. Is there any? This might be hard because you've talked to so many. Is there any one story or one guest that was like stood out and like really just blown you away, or anything that you could share?
And I will tell you, I've interviewed hundreds of people at this point, and so that's a tough question. So the answer is yes. There are many ones, and a lot of the criteria to get on the show it's a pretty high bar, right? So I mean, people like Seth Godin, who most of the listeners will know, who's you talk to the guy like him, and you're like, dude, this guy's super smart, and he's like a wealth of knowledge and has like tons of context. Someone like Stephen Kotler, who's an expert at flow, and he's written like Becoming Superman and a bunch of other books. Like, that guy's like, dude, like next level, man. Like, you start talking to him, you're like, this guy just knows his shit inside and out. Jamie Wheel's like that too, who these folks are just brilliant, right? Will Guidara, who used to run 11 Madison Park, he has that book on reasonable hospitality. Those are all great people, but there's so many. I mean, like it's pretty amazing. And for me, I'm kind of a multifaceted person. So even Pronger, right? You're talking about Chris Pronger. He's a friend of mine. Pronger is a freaking beast. The guy was an Olympic gold medalist and had won a couple Stanley Cups. Like, dude, like just to like hear someone talk about how they thought about stuff to make those things happen. It's just cool. Someone like Moby that was a rock star, like, how do you become a rock star? I mean, the dude is just, they're one of a kind. So no, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I'm barely even scratching the surface of the surface. Like the show has so many awesome people. It's something. One of the great joys of my life is getting to do the show and just meeting incredible people, and I get to do that all the time. So I feel lucky, but yeah, there's no one, like the whole show.
Okay, I imagine it'd be hard to pick.
It's impossible. It's like impossible to pick.
One last question for you.
I'll give you one, Andrew. Mike Cato, who's your co-host. our episode was super fun. He's a great guest.
Cato's always fun to listen to.
Yeah,
he's always great. All right, one last question for you, man. Looking back, you've had a great career so far. You're still young. I'm sure you've got plenty left that you'd like to accomplish and do. But looking back on your career, if you had to start over again, is there one thing you would tell yourself like that maybe some mistakes that you could avoid or things that lessons that you've learned along the way? Like, what can you share that people can learn from?
Yeah, it depends on when you ask me this question. Like asking me this question a few years ago, I would have told you, yeah, I picked the wrong industry. I think lending industry was not a super perfect fit for me. Not that the product's a great product, but it's very interest rate cyclical and volatile, and that volatility and cyclicality is not a great match for my personality. I'm very like kind of slow and steady wins the race, and that industry is not that. And so I think that picking an industry that matches your personality is really important. And it's hard to know that when you're young because you don't really know yourself yet. Like I didn't know, like I knew I was a person that was like more of a conservative, slow and steady person wins the race. And I'm not, I'm not a huge risk taker. I am a huge risk taker in some ways, but not in that.
I was going to say, it sounds like you are. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I always say I'm not a huge risk taker, but I take a shit ton of risk. I'm not I'm not a gambler, I guess. It's calculated risk. Like for me, I'll take calculated risk. But I'm not a big gambler, and that industry, like you're kind of like betting on what happens with there's a lot of geopolitical and macroeconomic things that are out of your control that have nothing to do with the business or industry that completely affect what tomorrow's going to look like, and that doesn't match my personality. And so the one, like if I could get in a time machine and go whisper in 23-year-old Darius's ear, I'd be like, hey bud, like I know you think you're gonna make a lot of money in this in the short run, but in the mid run or long run, like it's the wrong fit for you, because personality wise, like you're not a gambler and you're going to get really shooken up by rates going up and down and it affecting, you having to lay off a bunch of people because rates go up 2 points. Like that's not going to do well for your psyche. And it ended up not. So I do think like listeners should be on the lookout for like, what's the industry that really fits their personality. And it's hard to know, like, but I think you can get clear on what your personality is and out of the gate be like, oh, that's a good industry. So an example would be like, hey, I'm not a gambler and I like to have success. I probably shouldn't go into like the entertainment business because there's 99% unemployment in that business, right? Scott Galloway, Prof G, talks about that. And so for me, I like helping people and I like numbers. So I think I found a good area, which is finance. But yeah, I think I spent a lot of time trying to make it work in a space that just wasn't fully aligned with me. Now I could probably go back into that space because I have so much domain expertise now, and I'd be okay with the ups and downs because I just know that's part of it. But it took a long time to figure that out.
I think that's an incredibly powerful learning, because if you have that misalignment, then it's going to impact your ability to perform and be happy and, the sustainability of it. So I think that's really
powerful. I agree.
All right, Darius, this has been great, man. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing it with us. Before we wrap, where can listeners go to learn more or connect with you directly?
Yeah, no. So yeah, The Greatness Machines, my podcast, is on all podcast platforms. You can get my book, The Core Value Equation, where all books are sold, on Audible as well. You go to my website, therealdarius.com, but those are all things, they're all there. Therealdarius.com is a good one, but I always tell people start with those 3 things. And then I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram and all that good stuff. And you can look me up on LinkedIn with my name, which is a long spelling. You can look it up in the show notes. But if you want to look me up on Instagram, it's iamthedarius.com, or I am the Darius. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I am the Darius that's what my social handles are.
Okay. All right. Well, Darius, thank you again. Really appreciate it. And everyone, thank you for listening and joining, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.